Hello, and welcome to this episode of Joshua and YouTube channel. I was about to say Philosophy All, then I realized that this was on the other channel indeed. Today, as the name suggests, we are indeed responding to the atheist meltdown, which has kind of occurred on both of my recent videos, which was titled Oxford Student shares why he believes in God, and also Oxford Student shares why Christianity is true. It is quite surprising that the videos weren't doing very well, and then I decided to put Oxford Student into the title, and all of a sudden they blew up. Well, they didn't really blow up by YouTube standards, but they went from getting around 100 views to around 800 views, so it's an 8-time increase by just putting Oxford into the title. So I was quite surprised, and I thought, well, all right, this is quite a good idea, so let's do a response, as one of our friends suggested in the comment section, to indeed do a response to all the criticism that I got on the video, which is always very enjoyable. So as you can see here, let us check here. Crazy how putting Oxford Student in the name boosts so much views. And then someone said, hey Josh, I was thinking, what if you made a live streamer video going over what people in the comments were saying on your recent videos? Interesting way to talk about this discussion. Well, as you know me, I always want to make the videos for you. And the best ways to make the videos for you is to make and talk about the videos that you want to be discussed. So let us get right into it. We're going to go into our review as always. We'll read through these comments and give you some thoughts about them. It's always quite funny how these things.
We're going to first cover some of the arguments for the existence of God, as well as how some of the responses to these arguments are unsatisfactory, and also talk about some of the arguments against
you're getting beaten up here,
and show why some of the responses to them actually are very powerful, and thus I know why it is good reasons to believe in God. And the reasons to not believe in God aren't as strong. We can come to the conclusion that God
often debaters on one side develop resentment for another's video.
And let's get right into it. There are two main arguments I would recommend
to say thank you very much for
when they're entering into questioning whether God exists or not. This is not to say there are numerous arguments
you're regularly on God in the history of Christianity
and the thing is, in the philosophy of religion, for example, there's ontological argument, there's newer arguments like harmony, and cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, and so forth.
Ultimately, there is
however, the two that I would recommend people go to, partially because they're the most simple, but also because they are the easiest to present and understand, and also they have a lot of literature on them, is the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument. Both arguments are more simple, do have a lot of quite strong and robust arguments for them, as well as a lot of different responses to them, which have become quite common in literature, and so it's quite easy to familiarize yourself with that debate. Let's first look into cosmological arguments. There's a few different cosmological arguments. There's the Kalam cosmological argument, which says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe.
I know what's going on. Stop sharing screen. Present. Share screen. I know exactly what's going on. Do not share audio. Tab audio. Brilliant. That's how it is, because I was reading the comments and the video was indeed playing. That's exactly what was happening. It was good to do. But essentially, what was going on, what I was trying to say essentially, was to say a lot of people are not very thick-skinned or in real life. And as a result, when you're commenting on people's discussion, it's important to be quite nice to them. Of course, I'm kind of thick-skinned, so I don't really care. But if you actually want to get your point across and try to convince someone, instead of making someone think that you're an idiot, well, you probably should be nice to them. And even if I'm not offended by these people, if people are indeed dicks in the comment section, it just reflects poorly on their education. And as a result, it still doesn't make anyone want to engage seriously with their comments. So that's just something to get started off with. And let us get into some of these comments. So Gabri41 says, the main problem with all arguments for God is that they never logically explain why the first cause, unmoved mover, or necessary being is a person. The person of this first cause is the single most important aspect of it. And then it says basically, if the first cause is not a person, it is just a force of nature like gravity or quantum fields, then it is irrelevant to how I live my moral life. Well, this is indeed a reasonable objection, and I completely agree with it in so much as the fact that if it was what we were trying to do, then, and all we were trying to do was to prove a first cause, independent of whether or not it was a person, then these arguments indeed would fail as an argument against the existence of God. That is something I would very happily accept. However, when we are looking at this, it's very important that we separate the different stages of these arguments. For example, when you have the cosmological argument, you have of course, the stage one of the argument, which is saying, well, why does this necessary ground of being exist? And secondly, what is that first cause which exists? And as a result, you get the stage one, which is, does a necessary first cause exist? And stage two, what is the nature of that cause? So the objection that Gabri is making here makes complete sense and is something that scholars in the literature have recognized for a very long time. You first establish a necessary cause, then you figure out what that nature is. And there's arguments for why people think it's personal. For example, if something is timeless, what makes something timeless move into action to create a world? Well, some people would say it means that that thing has libertarian free will, or it has some form of free will. There's different ways that people have tried to present this. You could look at the works by Josh Rasmussen, or I think William Lane Craig. They do touch upon that stage two of the argument a bit more. That is something you can indeed go and look at. And then here it says, YouTube theists all present 5 to 6 arguments, all which are easily proved to be fallacious. They've been demonstrated to be nonsensical thousands of times, and yet they still persist. At this point, ridicule seems like a fair way of dealing with their childish notions. Well, the funny thing here is that most of these arguments are not fallacious and irrational. The only person who's fallacious and irrational is indeed you. You don't really know what a fallacious argument is. A fallacious argument does not necessarily mean it's, well, a fallacious argument is a wrong argument, but not all wrong arguments are fallacious. I could present a completely valid argument, which is not fallacious, and have it be incorrect. Fallacies are a certain way in things which can be wrong, but it's not the only way in which things can be wrong. So if someone says to me, your argument's fallacious, and I'm like, well, this is not fallacious, it doesn't mean I'm right, but also doesn't mean that you could say, well, oh, everything I disagree with is fallacious. That's just not how reasoning works. In order to actually develop your philosophical education, it's important to recognize that not all arguments you disagree with are fallacious. There are other ways in which you can respond to it. Of course, fallacies are a common way in which you engage or you respond, or at least it's a very good thing to start off with when you're checklisting what went wrong with this argument. Why do I disagree with it? Does it commit a fallacy? Is probably one of the first things you should look at. But it doesn't mean all of them commit fallacies, especially when it comes to peer-reviewed journals and when people actually publish on actually well-reputable sources and well-reputable platforms like peer-reviewed articles, as I said. The chances of people presenting fallacious arguments is very unlikely. Now, is it to say it's completely unlikely? No, but it's very unlikely that people are still peer-reviewing fallacious arguments, because the peer reviewers, who are also academic philosophers, would note that and raise it and flag it. Now, of course, if someone's just reading a blog post and say, oh, everything's fallacious and stuff like that, well, obviously you see things there, but that's also another problem. People who engage with internet atheism or internet philosophy often engage with the blog post instead of the academic theology and academic philosophy, and as a result get that a bit mixed up. So that's just a way to clarify that comment. And it says that, what's the next comment? Here, about, I'm not saying if a true causal relationship doesn't really exist, it means that anything can happen or that things will be floating out of nowhere. That left me a bit confused. Why wouldn't it mean that? Okay, this concept is not necessarily objection. It's just to say, well, all right, why if there was no causal relation, or why if you deny the principle of sufficient reason, things are not just going to happen for no reason. What I was making the argument is to say, well, a common objection to the principle of sufficient reason is to say, or at least a common defense of the principle of sufficient reason is to say, well, oh, if the PSR was wrong, or if the principle of causation was wrong, things are just going to happen all of a sudden out of no reason and for no reason. That is not necessarily a reasonable thing to say, because if the principle of sufficient reason doesn't hold, it could be the case that there's absolutely no causation at all and nothing happens and nothing changes. There's other alternatives in which, or what that could be entailed by the principle of sufficient reason, which is not proven or not demonstrated by this idea of everything coming out into existence out of nothing. Alternatively, you could just have, as I've said, things not changing at all, or things not happening, or the fact that time is stagnant and nothing is being caused or affected because everything already exists. So the idea to say, so what I was saying there is just to say, let's not jump the gun. Actually, I was defending and steel manning the atheist position, which is something you should do. I was saying, well, look, it might not be good to just try to reductio ad absurdum everyone by saying, oh, you believe in the principle of sufficient reason, or you don't believe in the principle of sufficient reasons, that means you believe everything must be coming out of nowhere. That's not the case. There are other alternatives to the principle of sufficient reason, which does not lead people to say, oh, everything's coming out of nowhere. Of course, it is possible that the principle of sufficient reason is false, then things will start coming out of nowhere, but it's definitely not entailed by the denial of the principle of sufficient reason. So that is essentially my response to this video in the comments. Now, why is it God instead of gods? They all have the rationale for why they exist. So part of the reason could exist could take into account a vast number of gods. Many of these are not compatible. Why is it polytheism instead of monotheism that I am presenting? Well, the reason why I'm presenting polytheism instead of why I'm presenting monotheism instead of polytheism is because all the arguments are pointing towards a singular first cause. One should not, as Occam's razor says, one should not multiply causal necessities or metaphysical realities or beings, entities beyond requirements. And as a result, if you need a necessary first cause, you only really need one. This is not to say there can't be many, but it's just more reasonable to come to the conclusion that there's one. Secondly, there's not many reasons or many arguments in the literature to argue for polytheism. There's lots of arguments for monotheism. I'm yet to see in any of the major philosophy of religion journals anything arguing for polytheism, or at least in the sense of, oh, there is multiple necessary beings. You could argue that idea in itself is inconsistent. I haven't looked too much into that depth of arguments, but all that is to say is that most of the arguments are indeed for classical monotheism and not for polytheism. And you could just look at the major religions in the world. Most of them are monotheistic apart from Hinduism. And even Hinduism, you could argue, at least some people read it as monotheistic. Feel free to let me know any further questions in the comments below or in the comment section, and I'll happily answer them there. Now, now here you go. I don't have unlimited time to break down every argument in this video, but the Kalam is the first one you mentioned. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That is indeed the Kalam argument. Neither one or two are assertable, so it's already dead in the water. Personally, it's done there, but for fun, let's continue as if it isn't completely over. If you take faith in 1 and 2, which you have no reason to do so, then the universe having a cause follows, which begins an infinite chain of causes forever. Then you tell me that God is uncaused. That breaks premise 1. That is not the case. If you tell me that God is eternal, you've essentially weaseled God into the picture. Now, of course, the argument is absolutely horrendous. I don't want to say this because I'm saying the guy is an idiot, but unfortunately, the argument you guys provides is not very good. Very clearly, premise 1 and premise 2 are assertable. I think what he means here is to say they're propositions. He's trying to say these cannot be presented or these cannot be propositions, which just doesn't seem to make sense at all, because evidently, even if you disagree with premise 1 and premise 2, they are propositions which can either be true or false. You can indeed apply truth values to these presentations. For example, everything that begins to exist has a cause is either true or false. It's clearly assertable. It can clearly be presented in a proposition. The same goes with the universe began to exist. The universe either began to exist or the universe didn't begin to exist. To say that this is not assertable would be to say, well, oh, we cannot even make sense of the sentence or the proposition of, oh, the universe began to exist, which just is not the case. We clearly can think of that. And he says, well, oh, if you take faith in 1 and 2, you have infinite causes. Not necessarily, because number 1 just says everything that begins to exist has a cause. If something doesn't have a beginning, therefore it doesn't have a cause, and therefore you don't have an infinite chain of causes. So that argument so his idea that an infinite chain of causes follows from premise 1 and 2 is just wrong. And then the second idea of, if God is uncaused and that breaks premise 1, that does not break premise 1, because the premise 1 just says everything that begins to exist has a cause. We're saying God is uncaused, and that is because, well, he doesn't begin to exist, and thus that does not break premise 1 at all in any way possible. So his second argument here just doesn't work. And his third argument also doesn't work, because he says, oh, you've smuggled God into the picture. None of here have we actually said God. We just said there must be one necessary cause to begin with. So we haven't smuggled anything in. We're just talking about the entailment of the deductive argument. So if you have a deductive syllogism, which is of a modus ponens, if you have if and then you have if, and in the conclusion you have then well, I didn't present it very well. If you have X, modus ponens is essentially if you have X, then you have Y, you have X, therefore Y. To affirm Y does not mean you're smuggling anything into this premise. You're just following the logical conclusion. So that comment also just is incorrect here. Terrible arguments, cracking up for you book that dismantle those two pathetic arguments you've highlighted. Jokes on you, these aren't terrible arguments. You could just open numerous books and you could see why there are at least not bad arguments. They might not be correct, but I don't think anyone literally in the history of academia has ever said there are horrible books, unless you're reading Richard Dawkins, which at that point you're not reading academic articles, and thus, well, you've kind of completely destroyed your own position, which is it's a bit of a joke at that point. But that's a bit unfortunate because, well, you know, it's one thing to look at popular level books, which are all well and good. I mean, as I've said in a few comments on this channel, the goal of this YouTube channel and the goal of popular level books is to direct you to academic content. But if you then say, well, the popular level books are the same as academic content and are as serious as academic content, you clearly don't know what you're talking about. And as a result, it's very important for us to direct you to the academic sources, which I've done in this video. And of course, the videos I'm referring to here, I'm directing you to the academic sources, the academic literature. Go read that. And then you can actually talk a bit more about this seriously, instead of saying, well, these are bad arguments, they have been debunked everywhere. That's not the case. They only give them, some popular level books give the impression that they're debunked, when in actuality in academia, they have not been yet. And that's just something people should keep in mind. Let's carry on. The Kalam cosmological argument and fine-tuning are both void. That's not... These provided no arguments there. There's a logical fallacy of special pleading by your choice of the Abrahamic God rather than any of the multitude of gods. Well, that is not exactly the case. There's no logical fallacy of special pleading here at all. I don't think the guy knows what I think. For most notably, the guy just hasn't read the title of the video. I'm not saying why the Abrahamic God is true. That was for my more recent video, why Christianity is true. All I'm here is saying is why there is a first God which exists. Now, Dak James says, the argument of first cause is flawed on basic premise. Why must everything have a cause? Couldn't it just be random with no cause? Well, it could very much be random without a cause. It's just that that's not the case of what we experience. The world does not exist in randomness. And this is the place where you can then bring in to say, well, if you think everything is random, then how do we have a perception of causation? Most people who object causation at least still promote some form of constant conjunction, or at least some idea of causation as a form of the framework, in the terms of Kant, through which we understand the world. There is a structure through which the world comes to us in a structured fashion, even though it may or may not be random. However, what he's saying here is to say, well, oh, there is indeed something which is random. Well, we just don't observe randomness. So that's just not the case. It cannot be random because we just don't see randomness. Now, the second objection he makes is, if we go a step further, why can't it be infinite recursive? The universe could be infinite, going back forever in time. Mathematically, there are some problems with that, even though absolute infinity is indeed a mathematical concept. I can direct you to an interview with Graham Oppy on this topic of infinities. It is also the case that even if mathematically infinities work, when you try to apply it to the world, it creates all sorts of paradoxes, because then you could say, well, you're adding time to the series, but then at the same time, the series is of the same length, because 1 plus infinite is still infinite. You can add an infinite to an infinite, and it's still an infinite. Our experience of this progressing a theory of time, it just doesn't work with infinities, because you will have to say, if the past was indeed infinite, that even though 100 years in the future, the same amount of time has passed in the past as it is 100 years in the future. And it would still be the same amount of time passed in the past as is 100,000 times in the future. So that just simply doesn't make sense if we're looking at this progressive theory on time. I think infinities become a bit more of an interesting concept when it comes to a B theory of time, which says time just exists throughout the whole series of time frames. Then you can say, yep, seems to make sense, or at least there's more reason for you to believe in the possibility of infinities. But if you believe in a dynamic theory of time or an A theory of time, that does indeed become a bit more difficult. Same goes with those bad premises that aren't bad premises for the reason I said above. It still provides other properties from the original cause being God. The God could be the laws of the universe. Well, it can't be the laws of the universe because that which created the universe cannot be part of the universe. Otherwise, that would be a self-creation, self-defeating. But then at the same, so thus that which created the universe cannot be the laws of the universe. Now, of course, as I've said at the very start, there's stage 1 and stage 2 of the cosmological arguments. We've talked about stage 1, now we talked about stage 2. So that's something which, so his argument here just doesn't work too well. Let me present to you some arguments towards no God. Biggest determining factor of religiosity is the culture you were born into. Well, that's once again is an example of the genetic fallacy. People are born into loads of different circumstances, and that normally just defines what you are. An atheist is born to an atheist family, is most likely going to be an atheist, at least when he's growing up. And as such, unless you want to defeat atheism as well in this argument, that simply doesn't work. Secondly, everyone who prays to a god has asked for health, but the biggest determining factor for health and longevity is what you eat and not what you pray to. That's also easy to grant. Doesn't prove God or disprove God at all. It just says you have to look after your bodies, which is indeed a Christian message as well. So the idea that, oh, I can pray to God. Oh, the fact that I jumped off the building and prayed to God and God didn't save me. Oh, therefore God doesn't exist. Well, you're stupid. You jumped off the the building. You're not looking after yourself. Then of course you're not going to be treated well. God takes your free will reasonably and takes your free will seriously, and thus would defend it, and the consequences of that. 3, infant and child mortality has no purpose for anyone if God is all good. No reason for him to create this cruelty. Very big problem. But at the same time, the problem of evil with these things, these are part of natural processes, which is part of how the world came to be. The fine-tuning argument says how the world came to be is very, very unlikely. It's very difficult for us to change these parameters. Perhaps this is the only way. That is something which seems to be completely reasonable to me. During our recent period, COVID viruses infect and killed people without religious discrimination. You know, that doesn't mean anything's right or wrong. That's just, as I've said previously, that's how natural processes work. Viruses just infect people, not depend on your religion, but because you are a human being. Try praying and nothing out of the ordinary would happen. Well, you know, I pray a lot and I think a lot of good things happen. So I think that's wrong. Now, life as a layman, he doesn't really provide much arguments here. Where's the next arguments? He does it. That's not an argument. All arguments for the existence of God are obviously flawed. For example, please demonstrate everything has a creator, because 99.999% of the stuff has no known creator. Is this man being serious? Everything, we're not talking about creators, we're talking about causes, and most things at least have some cause to it. The reason why my pen case exists is because there's a cause. The reason why my pen exists is because there's a cause, there's a creator. The reason why my other pen exists is also because there's a creator. The reason why everything you see around has a cause, at least a cause, and if not a creator, if it's created. And thus this argument is just simply wrong. So it's actually quite funny, this argument. That's all the comments we had on this video, as you can see. And hopefully this clarifies some of the objections here. Let us indeed turn to this is not the video I was trying to go to, not the rise of sexist young men. Of course, sexist young men is a topic that does need attention, but that is not something that we're going to talk about. The second one, as you can see here, this is where I change the title, and all of a sudden, bam, loads of views, which is kind of crazy. This is a very funny comment. Christ is King made a very, very funny comment, which says, new atheist, after seeing this, he must be a freshman. Maybe he got lucky, but it's impossible for smart people to disagree with us because we're the genius and the Christians are stoners because they believe in fairies. What a brilliant comment. I think this just completely encapsulates the idea. Now, the funny thing is, most biblical scholars would disagree with me on most every point. That's not the case. Most biblical scholars, I think, would not necessarily always agree with me, but would agree on most of the points I made in this video. The arguments I made in this video are very, very, of course, dumbed down because this is indeed a 13-minute introduction to the topic. But it's also the case that most of the things presented by the minimal facts approach, at least to the resurrection, Gary Habermas notes that most scholars and historians do agree on those minimal facts. Most people don't disagree with the facts I was presenting, which is people claim that God exists, Ventastus, Suetonius, and things like that. A lot of Christians were being persecuted, which is also something that is supported everywhere across history, that people saw him after the resurrection of the dead, of Christ. Once again, that's very well attested. Most people agree on the fact that the disciples agree with him. So all of that is just, the idea that people disagree with me is just incorrect. He clearly hasn't read enough biblical scholarship to support all of that. Now, this is quite funny. It goes to show all that education's still dumb as a rock. And this is how you need to just respond to some stuff in a bit of jest. I'll never say I'm very smart, but I would say if I'm as dumb as a rock, then most of society must be very stupid. And the guy really wanted me to elaborate on what I was trying to say. So I just said, well, okay, if I'm dumb as a rock, which I'm more than happy to grant, I think, people take things too seriously and say, I have to be very smart. That's not exactly how we should do things. But I said, well, if I'm dumb as a rock and I'm at the best university in the world, which I am, then, well, our whole society is kind of screwed, isn't it? Which is honestly quite funny, but such is life, right? Such indeed is life. Now, second thing, Thanks for sharing this perspective as someone who's created educational content. Offer a few thoughts in response. That sounds good. Resurrection argument. Sure, let's see what he says. First, the disciples' willingness to suffer or die proves the resurrection is often overstated. Pointed out that we have very little historical evidence about how most of the disciples died, let alone they died specifically for proclaiming the resurrection. Martyrdom stories we often come from later church traditions, not from reliable first-century sources. And even if they're sincerely believed rose from the dead, belief doesn't equal truth. People across cultures and religions died for things that were historically weren't historically or factually accurate. Yeah, that is the case, but I also disagree with it. The reason why I disagree with this proposition, there's 2 points in it. Firstly, I'm not arguing from the fact that people were willing to be martyred to the fact that their claim was true. What they were claiming is, I saw Jesus. Well, they did indeed see Jesus. Well, if someone believes they saw Jesus and they died for it, they might not have actually seen Jesus, but at least they believed that they saw Jesus. So a lot of objections here are saying, well, just because someone died for you doesn't mean, or just because someone died for something doesn't mean that something is true. I'll grant that 100%. We all agree on that. No one's claiming that, or just because the martyrs died, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. What we are saying is, just that the martyrs died, it means that they must have believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And then we have to ask ourselves, why did they think Jesus rose from the dead? That is the true question. That's why I was saying in the video, people misinterpret that with their objections, as you can see. Now, the second point, which says, well, we have very limited traditions about how most of the disciples died. Not necessarily. We have evidence of the disciples dying in Acts. We have a lot of martyrdom accounts which come within the first 3 centuries of the church. A lot of Atheists come from there. I think Pliny writes to Trajan in 110 AD. So that's around 60 years after the whole events of the Gospels, and then he's talking about how they're persecuting Christians. Who's it? Tacitus writing about the persecution of Christians after the fire of Rome. Suetonius writing about the Christian persecution. Athenagoras writing in response. Like the amount of testimonies about people getting killed for being Christians is a lot. And yes, they might not all be in the 1st century, but the idea of, things must be in the 1st century is something that no historian actually believes in. Most people recognize that you might have a few primary sources which come from the time, but a lot of these secondary sources that we have, which are a bit more reliable in some cases, are indeed written 100, 200, 300 years later. So the fact that something is written 200 years later, 300 years later, does not necessarily mean it's wrong. So this idea of historical standards, you have to be consistent across the board when you're doing your historical inquiry. And I think if you say, well, we cannot believe or we cannot trust the fact that the disciples died because we don't have 1st century sources for them, that's not a very good argument, because if you did accept the argument, you'll have to throw out most of history as well. Now, when is an argument considered fallacious and it isn't? And isn't it? I believe a lot of arguments for God are circular. Well, it depends on what arguments you're talking about. I don't think most arguments for God is circular. I mean, the cosmological argument is most likely not circular. I don't think it's circular. I haven't read anywhere where it's circular. Fine-tuning argument, I don't think it's circular. Design argument might be circular, because you could say, well, I observed design, therefore must be a designer, but then that's dependent on the fact that you've assumed that things are designed already. So arguably you could say that's circular, but essentially the way to think about is something circular or not is to say, well, okay, I have premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, premise 4, premise 5. It follows in a very clear system, A, B, C, D, E. Your argument follows towards the conclusion. If it's circular, you'll notice that one part of that conclusion or one part of your argument presupposes what comes later. So if I said, well, or is based on something above. So for example, if I said, A proves B, B proves C, but in order for A to be true, C is true as well. You get the circle. Or if C is true, then that means A is true. You kind of get that. Not if C is true, then A is true. But no, that's not what I was trying to say. Sorry, my brain's kind of fried. I sat an exam for 3 hours and 45 minutes before filming this. But essentially what I'm trying to say is an argument is circular if your argument presupposes the truth of your conclusion. So if I'm saying God exists because the Bible says so, the Bible is true because God exists, well, that's circular, because you can see that your line of reasoning is based on the own premises. Well, your conclusion is based on the premises, and the premises are also based on the truth of the conclusion, and thus it's just a vicious circle. But if it doesn't follow that structure, for example, the cosmological argument, if everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, you can see it flows straight down. It doesn't presuppose God existing in order for the first premise to be true. However, if you wanted to make the cosmological argument circular, maybe someone would say something like this, to say, well, God causes the universe to exist, and therefore if God exists, then the universe will have. How would you make it circular? I don't even know, because I don't think you could make the argument circular, because the argument isn't circular. That's the thing. But yeah, the classic argument for a circular argument is if you just presuppose the conclusion. So if you're saying, well, which is the Bible example, right? That's probably the most common 101 circular argument. Or if I was trying to say, what's another argument of circular? We presuppose. My brain is fried. I apologize, guys. My brain is fried. My brain is fried. Let's carry on with the thing. If you want to ask more questions about circular reasoning, do let me know, and I'll elaborate on what I've just said. Second, the claim that the resurrection is unique in religious history isn't accurate. There are many stories of heroes. Yep, religious figures who ascended to heaven, became divine, or appeared after death. I agree. The idea of a special figure being glorified after death was not unheard of. However, what is indeed unique about the resurrection claim is the idea that God came down from heaven, the perfect omnipotent God came down from heaven to die for us and to make himself the lowest of the low, to die for us and to forgive us for our sins. You don't find that in history. I'm yet to find a model which you have God, not just, Zeus or these lesser gods, but literally God of the universe coming down, not because, he wants to show how good he is, but to save us out of humility, self-deprecation, to say, well, I love you and I would sacrifice myself to you. I'm yet to find that in history. So it is unique. Now, as for Andrew Loke, his arguments have been carefully critiqued. Well, I would recommend at that point to just go read the research about that. Now, so this point, I wouldn't discuss it too much. Here, you can go read. I'll recommend you to go watch my interview with Andrew Loke, go read the books that he's writing, then go read to the responses to what he was writing, go engage with that as well. Finally, Christianity's global spread and charitable influence, while impressive, doesn't demonstrate its metaphysical claims are true. That is true. That I completely agree with that. I'm not saying that, just because this is charitable, therefore its metaphysical claims are true. But of course, you need to recognize that this video is in the context of us already proving the existence of God. Therefore, I'm saying if God exists, what religion is most likely to be true? If God exists, the religion which does most good and most charity and is most widespread in the world is most likely to be true. That is the argument that I am indeed making here. Now here, Rico, first, the historical stuff about the resurrection isn't as solid as you make it seem. Most historians, whether they believe or not, say their methods can only show early Christians thought Jesus rose, not that something supernatural actually happened. Blah, 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 blah. The Gospel of Mark or whatnot mentioned stuff. Claims like that need more than just late stories from devoted folks. Well, the thing is here, that's once again, and then he says dying for a cause doesn't mean it's true. I agree with this. As I've said earlier in this live stream and in this response, no one is saying that, my brain is frozen. No one is saying that just because people died, therefore their claim is true. What we are alternatively saying is that, well, because people died, what they thought, it was correct, that they were willing to die for what they thought was true, not necessarily what was true. And as a result, we have to then question, well, okay, why do these people believe it? And he says, Paul writes and mentions visions, not an empty tomb. Well, Paul talks about the fact that if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then all of this would be in vain. That would indeed show that these. So that would show that Paul thought of a resurrection. Now, Christians' moral ideas are great in a lot of ways, but they're not the only ones out there. Stoic philosophers, Buddhists, modern human rights people have a solid way to talk about human dignities. Well, I think Buddhists are closest to the Christian truth. Modern human rights is a complete shambles of a situation. Just talk to anyone. You don't have a metaphysical backing for that. So Christianity really is one of the only things, like atheism doesn't really have any reason for why people should be moral at all. It could say, well, why we should be moral is because we follow the convention and what everyone else is doing. But if someone says, well, okay, well, I don't like the convention, I'm just going to go my own way and kill at people, as long as you can't actually stop the guy, You can't really convince a guy to do something else if the guy's an atheist and you're an atheist. There's no higher order. He says, well, my opinions do this. You say, oh, my opinions do this. It just basically he says, she says, and that goes all the way down. And you don't get any better than that, unfortunately. So yeah, these arguments are not necessarily powerful. All you can do to argue for the Christianity is the possibility of Christian God. Problem of evil denies all possibility. Well, the problem of evil has indeed been refuted in numerous parts. I mean, it hasn't been completely destroyed, especially the abductive problem of evil. There's people fall on different sides of the spectrum. There's enough, I would say, responses to the problem of evil as there are arguments for the problem of evil where people can reasonably fall on both sides. I would say. I think some people just look at evil and says, well, this is just horrible. I refuse to believe in God. And that's fine. You know, I think there's enough evil in the world for people to say, well, seriously, even if God exists, even if everything works out well in the future, this is what Ivan Karamazov says, right? Even if everything's good in the future, I still refuse to reject. I still refuse to accept that. Completely fine, completely reasonable. But you just have to think, you know, well, does it then mean that just because it's reasonable to talk one, we could talk the other? Not necessarily the case. Now, wouldn't the widespread argument be an appeal to popularity? Not necessarily. It depends what you're trying to do with it. Arguments are really only dependent or fallacious based on kind of the intention of the argument that you're making. For example, here I'm just making an abductive argument. I'm saying, well, if God exists, then you would expect a certain amount of things to see. So if you see those things, it'll boost the probability of God existing because it's just abductive, right? What's the best explanation for this? You have this idea of popularity, good, loving, charity, and all these things, miracles, and the sort. And if those things are true, then it increases the probability of that being true. So it's not necessarily that's not necessarily an appeal to popularity here, or at least not a fallacious appeal to one. Now, problem of evil is one of the worst atheist arguments. I disagree, actually. I would say problem of evil is the strongest atheist argument. Arguably, you could say there just aren't many good atheist arguments. But apart from the problem of evil and maybe divine hiddenness, which is essentially a part of the problem of evil argument, because ultimately both are saying, I don't really like the world that God creates, or this world doesn't really represent the existence of a God. You know, I don't necessarily think... Like, I think I can't think of any arguments which are stronger than the problem of evil. Let's debate the Trinity. I'm not familiar enough with the Trinity to discuss this. It's kind of complex, and to be very honest, I think it's very easy to fall into heresy when it comes to the Trinity. So I shan't discuss that. Let us go to the next point. Great video. A lot of people don't understand Christianity. That's true. Thanks for making educational videos. Thank you. Funny video. I'm going to assume that you're a freshman or something, and this video is an emotional response to the challenges of your belief that you learned over time. As a doctor of theology that is religious, wouldn't even try to make this argument. Bro's wrong. Because, well, Dr. Andrew Loke is a doctor of theology, and he does defend this argument. Same with Gary Habermas and Michael Cohn, and all these are people who are doctors of theology, so that's not the case. So I think this argument is completely wrong, and there's not really much to respond to this. And the idea that there's several Galatian miracle workers, there's no evidence or not enough significant arguments to support these in the same degree as Christianity. So that appeal is just wrong. If there were like 7 people with 7 major world religions, and I'll be like, okay, well, and 7 really good pieces of evidence, I'll be like, okay, maybe that's correct. But the reality is, you know, that just doesn't need response here. Now, where do we go? Resurrection, explanation that Jesus came back to life because he was God isn't even on the table. This simply doesn't have an explanatory power. Of course, it has explanatory power. Like some people try to just make these very bold statements when they're really not substantiated. For example, the idea that Jesus came back to life because he was God doesn't have explanatory power. Of course, it has explanatory power. Like if you have the question of, people saw this guy after he died. The guy clearly died. Loads of people saw him after he died. He appeared to numerous people. People were very confident that they saw him after his death. What explains this? Well, the fact that the guy actually rose from the dead does have explanatory power. Might not be true, but it does have explanatory power. So I mean, this objection that it doesn't have explanatory power is just wrong. Now let's say there's a difference between did Jesus rise from the dead and do we have good reason to believe that Jesus rise from the dead? I think both you can answer. I mean, you could say, did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, it's in the same way as you talk about any other thing about history, right? We can't know for sure, fine. But the reality is, most people, a lot of times in atheist dialogues, you see people say, oh, we need 100% certainty, we need 100% certainty. Talk to any serious philosopher in the history of the world, and they'll tell you, not everything is based on 100% certainty. Most things in philosophy are based on 60% certainty or 50%. Well, maybe not 50% certainty, because that would go two ways, but 60, 70% certainty. Arguments for it's a bit better than arguments against. Therefore, I think it's true. Does it mean that, oh, you must be correct all the time? No. But 100% certainty as a standard is completely ridiculous. In fact, the idea that water boils at 100 degrees all the time due to the problem of induction is not 100% certainty. It's most likely the case via inductive reasoning, but it is not 100% certainty. So the idea of, oh, we need 100% certainty, we can't know for sure, therefore we can't say anything, well, that simply is not a good argument. So he says the things you support are not reliable for supporting a supernatural event. No, I'm just making a historical argument here. That's all I'm saying. So this argument is not very reasonable. What else are some things, other arguments? I'll continue scrolling through this, but let us first answer the question in the chat. Nicholas Manyev. We're getting loads of Eastern bros on the channel, which is really good. What do I think is the best argument for the existence of God? I think the cosmological argument is very powerful. But I don't think it gets you very close to the Christian God or this God of classical monotheism. I do think it does prove a necessary first cause. I think the fine-tuning argument I think is quite reasonable as well. Abductively say, well, the universe is very unlikely that it exists to sustain life, but it does miraculously seem to sustain life. And in the resurrection argument, I think it's very reasonable. If someone says to me, mass hallucination, I mean, I can see why someone says mass hallucination versus, like, mass hallucination versus like mass hallucination versus resurrection. I can see someone say, okay, I just think that, what have I done? Pulled up another tab, hit my keyboard. But if someone says, oh, mass hallucination, it's equally as reasonable, fine. Like, if someone wants to accept that side, it's all right. In the same way that sometimes when I reply to people, like, why do I choose Christianity? It's like, it's kind of like choosing a diet. You have existential reasons, you have philosophical reasons, theological reasons, historical reasons. They all exist on a spectrum. Like, no one's saying, oh, I only believe this because, oh, all the reasons are 100% and existential is 0, or vice versa. It's a mix of different factors, a mix of different ideas. And that's when you're thinking about philosophy, you're thinking about these life choices. You have to say, well, what are my priorities here? How much evidence do I need to believe in something which has certain existential weight? And vice versa. It's not something which you go and just say, well, oh, everything is very clear in front of me. I can just look at everything in abstract or from a God's eye point of view. That's not how philosophy and experience works. Isn't naturalistic hypothesis more plausible than a supernatural one? Yes and no. I think naturalistic hypotheses in some sense are more plausible if you take an anti-supernatural bias to it, which is not saying that anti-supernatural biases are wrong, but at the same time, if you have this background of the cosmological argument, of the fine-tuning argument, you think there is a first cause of the universe which cares about the universe, which you get from fine-tuning argument. And then you have this where you're like, well, these hallucinations rarely exist. And a naturalist would most likely say, well, this is extremely, extremely freaky and a coincidence if it was a naturalistic hypothesis. Then you can say, well, perhaps the supernatural response is reasonable at this point of view, because it's not like you're saying, well, a naturalistic hypothesis in this case is, well, very reasonable. Most people don't believe in mass hallucinations, at least to the degree in which the disciples saw Jesus. And if that's the case, if you can't explain that from a naturalistic explanation alone, then, well, in that case, is saying, oh, a mass hallucination, is that equally as miraculous as my brain's not functioning very well, is it equally unlikely as us providing miracle? Well, it might be a miraculous situation. So even if you have a naturalistic result, it might not be a non-miraculous situation. For example, that's an example. It's a clear day and all of a sudden something comes out of nowhere, right? Like everyone's saying there's no humidity in the air at all, and then water just pours out in front of me. But inside the water, there's lightning and everything like that. But then that's like circumlocated within like the size of my hands. Now you could argue, oh, that's naturalistic occurrence. Rain's natural, lightning's natural, and all that stuff. But if there's absolutely no humidity in the air, there's no reason for there to be rain. There's no reason for there to be thunder. There's no clouds or anything like that for electrons to be moving at this rate to create lightning. You could say, well, that's completely naturalistic, but it doesn't mean it's not a miracle. So I would say there also is that idea where just because something's naturalistic doesn't mean it's not necessarily a miracle. And the idea of some guy walking alive, or Jesus walking after his death, might also be a naturalistic alternative or hypothesis. We just call it supernatural because it is miraculous. But ultimately, a guy walking around is a naturalistic phenomenon. And as a result, if you go down this line of reasoning, I think you start questioning, firstly, well, is there really a clear divide between the supernatural and the naturalistic? Like, what would really be supernatural is if you had, like, Jesus walking around as a phantom after his death. But Jesus, we believe in a physical reincarnation such that it is a natural body walking around. So if that's the case, is it really a naturalistic hypothesis? Is it really a supernatural hypothesis? There's that question there as well. Now, let's carry on with the comments. I think we're going to get through them quite quickly, which is good because I kind of want to shower and then sleep, but I'm quite tired after my exam. But okay, Jesus claimed to be God. That literally never happened. Jesus never claimed to be God. Well, that's just wrong. Jesus did claim to be God. I and the Father are one. There's numerous passages, part of the Gospel of John. And secondly, not only did Jesus claim to be God, all his apostles believed that Jesus claimed to be God. There's a reason why Christians in the early church cared about the divinity of Christ. You look at Tertullian, you look at Irenaeus, you look at essentially Origen. Every major church father believes strongly in the divinity of Christ. And thus, if you take the truth of apostolic succession, which is the idea that the apostles witnessed Christ, they pass on the teaching to the people who followed them, they then pass it on. If everyone's saying Jesus claimed to be God, we have good reason to think that Jesus claimed to be God. Even if you threw away all the Gospels, you still have good reason to think that Jesus claimed to be God, because, well, all the apostolic testimony all say that Jesus was divine. And if that's the case, we should think that Jesus claimed to be divine. In the same way that if my grandfather dies and everything that he says was lost, but his children, his wife said this, his children said this, his grandchildren said this about him, you have more than enough reason to think that's probably an accurate description of what the guy believed in, even if you don't have his own original works, because he clearly taught that to the people who knew him and then passed that knowledge down to the children, the grandchildren, and so on. So that apostolic testimony claiming that Jesus claimed to be divine demonstrates the fact that Jesus claimed to be divine. Okay. Did you verify any of your claims with basic Google search? Well, I don't Google search things. I have Oxford Solo, the Bodleian Library, which gives me access to peer-reviewed journals. And thus, I do not have a basic Google search. I have peer-reviewed journals, which is arguably better. Now, most of my claims are blatantly false. Hasn't presented me any of which of my claims are blatantly false. Do you want to learn or just make claims? Well, I want to learn, but that's why I've made some arguments for my beliefs. Then you have, I thank you, Salvador. I see your comment. Very much appreciated. Do share and share this YouTube channel to people. I do hope that this brings educational content to the world. And of course, if you want more evidence about the arguments from the existence of God, make sure to check out the Apologist playlist on my other channel, Philosophy for All, where I interview some of the world's leading scholars on the existence of God. I'll put it in the chat as well as in the comments. So here, if you follow this link, I've put it in the chat. If you follow this link and indeed decide to, if you follow this link, you would be able to find Apologist Handbook, which gives you interviews on the major arguments of this God, the cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument, resurrection argument, and the sort, problem of evil. Everything on that is where you need to go in order to understand, does God exist or not? Or if you want to defend your faith, that's a good playlist to go, where I'm talking to some of the world's leading scholars. So I highly recommend you to go to watch that playlist. But going back to this, Who wrote the Gospels? Well, we have good reason. Well, I wouldn't say we have 100% certainty it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we have good reason to think that it was someone very close to the time the apostles wrote them. According to them, who witnessed the crucifixion? Well, basically, we have almost univocal evidence across history. We have essentially a lot of evidence across both Christian and non-Christian sources of Jesus being crucified. So, I mean, secondary non-gospel and historical sources. Well, you have essentially Suetonius, Tacitus, loads of places throughout history. So I mean, there's basically a lot of things going on there. Oh, why was I on those videos, but your channel is new? Oh, because that is my other channel. Like, this is my new channel, but I've had that channel for 5 years. I've been making channels on Philosophy for All for a very long time. I'll show you guys that channel very quickly, but essentially, just to finish off this statement, all of this crucifixion evidence, there's so much evidence of that throughout history. So, I mean, there's very good reason to believe in that. Everything else is just last two comments. Even if everything is true, you're worshiping entity you don't know anything about. No, that's wrong. If Christianity is true, then we do know things about God because he died and resurrected for us and loves us and came, and we have the scriptures to know about him. How have I known I haven't been tricked by an evil entity? Well, I know I haven't. Well, you can't really disprove that you've been tricked by an evil entity. If you really were tricked by an evil entity, then, well, we're all kind of done for. I mean, there's not much you can say about it at that point. And it's thoroughly brainwashed. Congratulations. Well, that ends off my response to all these comments. Maybe I am indeed brainwashed, but, well, such is life. If I was brainwashed, then, well, you know, we're in quite a bad situation in this world, aren't we? Aren't we all? Now, as I've said, well, let's go through my these comments. I disappeared for a bit. Too bad there isn't engagement, little chat engagement. That is indeed true, but that's such life. This channel is indeed a very small channel. Hopefully we grow it, and in order to grow it, I need your help. I need your support to like and subscribe and share it with your friends to talk about more Christian content. This channel is about Christianity. The other content is more about philosophy. So make sure you engage with this a bit more. Share it with your friends. Reflect about Christ. I want to share the love of Christ to you and the world. So make sure you check and subscribe to this channel. Also share it to your friends. This is, of course, the place where I want to bring you and direct you indeed to God. And yeah, so that is essentially almost all the comments here. Now, there is indeed a point, Philosophy for All, that I said I'll talk about. Philosophy for All is essentially the channel I've been running for like 5-6 years already. As you can see here, you go to Philosophy for All videos. I've been making this forever. All this video on this channel, why apologetics is important. It used to be called Apologetics for All, where I responded and talked about Christianity a bit more. So then I got interested in existentialism, and as you can see here, more of the videos went to Dostoevsky, some reviews of philosophy, and then it went more and more into existentialism and philosophy, and of course still some Christian videos in there, but lots of Dostoevsky, which is my main research belief. And then we talk a bit more about different forms of theology, lots of discussions in the past, just by myself, analyzing philosophical ideas, introducing certain books to you, best books on Christian existentialism, continue reading, some responses to current affairs, taking an Am I Gay BuzzFeed test, and then talking with Christians, then some discussions with some friends, interviews with scholars. But more recently, as you can see here, all these are interviews with scholars. So if you look at my last few videos, let's go to the latest videos. These are all interviews with scholars, latest videos, you can see here, interview with Dr. Eric Wheelingberg, one of the leading atheistic scholars. Animal suffering, I would say, is essentially the same as I respond to natural suffering. It's not the great, but that's the way the world is. In order to, we can't expect the world to be any other way. And if you do want the world to be any other way, then we have to have pretty good reason to think the world should be some other way. But I'm yet to see a good response to the fine-tuning argument. If someone says, like, if the fine-tuning argument didn't exist, then someone can say, there could be a million different types of world. But the fine-tuning argument says the only way in which the world can be the case is within this very small parameter. So if God creates that very small parameter, then some evil exists. Well, that's just part of life. You can't do much with it. And also, animal suffering is way less of a problem than human suffering because, well, and humans are worth way more than animals. And as a result, like if you ask me, would I rather have 1 million animals die versus 1 human go to heaven? I'll say 1 human go to heaven. I'll make the trade any day of the week. Let alone if you say, well, how many people go to heaven versus how many animals die? Like, would you say 10 million animals die versus 1 person go to heaven? You might say I'm morally callous, but I'll say, yeah, 10 million animals die. I'll still want 1 person to go to heaven. And if that's the case, then, well, animal suffering really is not as big a problem as you think it is. Now, you could say, oh, you're being anthropocentric. You're prioritizing humans. And, like, if Christianity is true, and of course, when you remember the problem of evil is an internal criticism, so you're granting the truth of Christianity to show a contradiction. If that's the case, then, well, there's no problem about being anthropocentric at all. So going back to this channel, I essentially on this channel just interview some of the world's leading scholars. So he's a leading scholar on Hegel, Dr. Andrew Locke, that we talked about if you want to learn more about the resurrection, Dr. Taylor Carman, leading scholar on Heidegger, over here, leading scholar on anti-theodicy here, talked with Joe Schmidt for a bit, Firas Moddad, a leading risk analyst, some interviews with Dr. Graham Oppie here, which is also very prominent. Dr. Aaron Simmons, one of the leading phenomenologist scholars, who's a good friend of mine as well. Dr. George Patterson, leading scholar on Christian phenomenology. So essentially, you have a lot of arguments here. And that's my other channel, so I highly recommend you go check that out. Do you debate atheists online? Not really. You know, I do touch apologetics a bit, but if you have noticed on my other channel, my major research interest is not apologetics. I talk about the problem of evil because I research about the problem of evil. But when I make these videos, this is kind of my side hustle or like my side brain working. I'm not an expert in apologetics or arguments for the existence of God. That's not my job. People at Inspiring Philosophy and stuff can do that. I'm not trying to prove the existence of God because, oh, that's my research focus. I have other focuses in mind that I'm more adept at talking about. So if someone wants me to give a lecture on phenomenology, 19th century theology, I can do that very well. I can talk about the problem of evil very well. Can I give a talk about why God exists? Yes. Do I think these arguments work? Yes. Are most of the responses from atheists strong? No. But then I would not say, oh, I'm going to start debating people because, well, I'm not an expert on the topic, and therefore I will not touch it. So as a result, I do not debate atheists. So thank you for watching this video. I'll just say atheists view life of many animals as greater than the life of one for the most part. Yes, I agree. But then that being said, we're not atheists. If an atheist says, well, oh, based on my standards, I don't think God exists, well, fine, go ahead. Of course, by the atheist standard, God doesn't exist because you're an atheist. If you weren't an atheist, or if you didn't think God exists, then you would be a theist. At that point, you would then accept my position. So, there's that problem as well. But thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed this response to all the comments and challenges that you had to kind of just show why these arguments don't work. Thank you so much for watching this video. Stay safe. God bless everyone. Hope to see you soon. And I would probably not make a live stream until start of July, just because I am very busy. I'm very tired. And yes, I do have six more exams to go over the next 2 weeks. So yeah, I'm going to have to do some revision, take a shower, go to sleep, and then wake up again. Because today is indeed a day of obligation. So if anyone's a Catholic in the chat, make sure you are indeed going to Mass, because today is indeed the Feast of the Assumption. Not the Assumption, the Ascension. And as a result, it's very important that you go to Mass today. At least if you're in the UK. I don't know whether it's a day of obligation anywhere else, but, very important to go to Mass. So stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.